Hey, it's your guy Tyrrell back with the interviews. In today's video, we're going to break down Frank Lampard's tactics in Chelsea's 2-1 win over Aston Villa. When we break down the game, when we do look at the board, we have Aston Villa dropping off in a 4-1-4-1. The logic behind Aston Villa's 4-1-4-1 is that they would have El Ghazi and Grealish in narrow, wide positions, and that would help Villa keep that center of the pitch compact to prevent Chelsea from penetrating in those central areas and having Giroud being able to link play with teammates and runners breaking forward. The downfall to that 4-1-4-1 was that it created avenues for the fullbacks to push forward based off the fact that Grealish and El Ghazi weren't tracking the movement of those players, and that's when we ended up seeing the fullbacks being pulled out of position. And ultimately, that was a constant theme throughout this game. Frankly, Chelsea played in a similar system. Yes, it was 4-3-3, but Kante was a bit deeper with Mason Mount and Kovacic having a bit more license to push forward. When we break down this game, first we're going to look at how Chelsea's attacking players were positioned and what their roles were against this Aston Villa backline. We'll start with Olivier Giroud, and he was often in between the center backs looking to receive the ball, but Chelsea often looked to play out into the wider areas rather than being direct and looking to play into Giroud over the top. What you can say is that with Aston Villa dropping off into a narrow 4-1-4-1, that central area of the pitch was compressed and the passing lanes into Giroud were limited. Therefore, when we look out to the wider areas, you have Willian and Loftus who were often adopting narrow positions. You ended up having Willian in between Mings and Target, but predominantly ahead of Target, and Target was tight on him. Willian also had the ability to shift out towards that right touchline, and that's where we would see Azpilicueta keep a narrow, deep right-sided position, and there were times where he did make underlapping runs to take El Ghazi out of the game and allow Willian to cut central to try and get in a shot on goal. When you look to the left-hand side, Loftus was often looking to drop off ahead of Kante into that gap between either Grealish and McGinn or El Ghazi and McGinn. So he was dropping off in that zone. He was looking to run across Kante to get onto crosses at the back post, and there were times where we saw him drifting laterally in behind that midfield bank. What we also saw from Loftus was that when Marcos Alonso was pushing forward, he was willing to make runs into space in behind Kante, and that's how we looked to affect the game. But the problem here was that when Loftus-Cheek did combine with Alonso by making those runs, Douglas Luiz didn't look to track the runs of Loftus-Cheek, but he looked to shift into that box to help block out the pullbacks. Then we shift into that midfield zone where we look at N'Golo Kante and Kovacic, who were holding deeper positions to try and limit the threat of Jack Grealish when he was looking to break in transition. But when you look at their overall position, they were in much deeper positions, looking to receive the ball as safe passing options. And N'Golo Kante in particular had more time on the ball because Davis wasn't tracking his movement, and he was able to shift diagonal balls out into the wider areas. The reason why Kovacic and Kante did sit more deeper than the rest of the Chelsea players was based on the fact that Chelsea were already attacking with 6 players. You had Loftus-Cheek and Willian tucking in a bit narrow. You had the fullbacks bombing forward, and then Mason Mount, who was Chelsea's most proactive midfielder, was looking to shift predominantly down that right channel to make darting runs in between El Ghazi and Target, and also Target and Mings. So he was involved combining with Azpilicueta and Willian, and that was Chelsea's most dangerous attacking outlet. And then when we look at the center backs, they played a key role in igniting the attacks because Davis wasn't able to track both of them. So when Christensen and Rudiger were able to push forward, they were finding gaps between the Aston Villa wide players and the midfield shuttlers, or they were simply wrapping the ball around El Ghazi and Grealish to play in Marcos Alonso and Azpilicueta. Ultimately, the manner in which Chelsea harmed Aston Villa the most was out in those wider areas through the fullbacks. And the reason why they were able to do that is because when we look at the positioning of Grealish and El Ghazi, they were tucked in narrow and they weren't tracking the runs or blocking off the passing lanes into Azpilicueta and Alonso. And the problem that you have there is that when the ball from Rudiger, Christensen, or Kante is shifted shifted out into that zone. What happens now is that Alonso and Azpilicueta pull out the Aston Villa fullbacks, and that leaves a lane for either a Chelsea midfielder or attacker to dart into, and that was a recurring theme throughout this game. When we look to the left-hand side, it was often Rudiger igniting these plays, wrapping the ball around the narrow, wide right Aston Villa player, or looking to find that gap between McGinn and El Ghazi, or McGinn and Grealish. When you look to the earlier stages, what you ended up seeing was Loftus-Cheek dropping off into that zone. Rudiger was able to slide the ball in between El Ghazi and McGinn to find Alonso, and that pulled out Kante. And what we end up seeing here was that Mason Mount made a run off Douglas Luiz to get that poked ball into that space. If we look to another example as to how they were able to break down that left-hand side, you have Rudiger sliding the ball beyond Grealish into the path of Kante, shifting into that narrow left-sided zone. And that's an example of Kante being that additional safe passing outlet. When Kante receives that ball, he ends up splitting McGinn and Grealish to find Alonso, and that pulls out Kante. And once again, you have Loftus-Cheek in that gap between McGinn and Grealish. And with Kante being pulled out, he darts into that left channel space. But when he receives that ball, Hause is pulled out, and when Loftus-Cheek tries to play that pullback, Douglas Luiz was covering space to clear those lines. So as you can see, that was a recurring theme down the left-hand side. They were able to find that gap for Marcos Alonso running off the narrow, wide Aston Villa player to pull out Kante. And then you would see Loftus-Cheek, and on the rare occasion, Mason Mount, when he was playing on the left-hand side, darting into that zone. However, Chelsea's most dangerous element of attack was down the right-hand side, and that was down to the varied movement of Willian, Azpilicueta, and Mason Mount. As stated earlier, what you end up seeing is Christensen pushing forward, and he's either looking to play the ball in between that midfield gap between the shuttler and the narrow left-sided Aston Villa player, or he's playing it around El Ghazi or Grealish to find Azpilicueta. That pulls out target, and it creates a gap for either Willian or Mason Mount to dart into. Another outlet would end up seeing Christensen split Hourihane and Grealish to find Willian dropping off deeper ahead of target in a narrow position, and then with Azpilicueta running off El Ghazi or Grealish, Willian could easily slide the ball out to Azpilicueta, and he could deliver a cross for Ruben Loftus-Cheek peeling off the back post, or Giroud darting in between the center backs. An example of all three players down that right-hand side combining was witnessed in that opening half. It stemmed through Kovacic having the ball ahead of McGinn and Douglas Luiz, and he ended up locating Mount in a gap between Hourihane and El Ghazi. When Mount receives that ball, what we end up seeing is that you have Loftus-Cheek drifting laterally in between the lines, and you end up seeing Mount slide the ball out to Willian on the touchline, which pulls out target. When target's pulled out, you end up still having Azpilicueta pushing forward into a narrow position beyond El Ghazi. And when that ball is pulled back to Azpilicueta, he's able to pick out either Ruben Loftus-Cheek or Giroud, but his cross is cleared. When we look to one final example, what we end up seeing is that we have Azpilicueta in a deeper right channel position, sliding the ball around El Ghazi for Willian, now shifting to the right touch line. When Willian does receive that ball, El Ghazi does a good job of recovering his positioning. What we see ahead of Willian is that we have Mount in between target and Hourihane, and then we end up seeing Azpilicueta pushing forward. When Azpilicueta pushes forward from a narrow right-sided position, he gets the ball, and that pulls out Hourihane, which ends up seeing Mount shift into a gap between target and El Ghazi. Now what Azpilicueta ends up doing is that he plays a quick 1-2 around Hourihane and gets that ball back from Mason Mount in a good goal-scoring position. The problem here is that his first touch is poor, and Mings is able to clear those lines. So as you can see in that opening half, Chelsea were constantly breaking down those wider areas, but they were finding more joy down that right-hand side, and that continued in the second half. The difference here is that Lampard did make some early changes. He ended up bringing on Ross, Barkley, and Pulisic, and although those players didn't significantly impact the pattern of the game, what Lampard was intending to do was to give Aston Villa a different threat pushing forward. You have Pulisic now, who offers a greater goal threat than Loftus Cheek with his dribbling, his guile, and his ability to get into good goal scoring positions. And then Ross Barkley also would look to break into the box. So they're looking to flood the box with more attacking players, and Aston Villa simply didn't rectify their issues in that opening half. So when we look to one of Chelsea's better chances created prior to that goal, it stems again through Christensen breaking forward down that right-hand channel and sliding the ball in between Hourihane and Grealish for Willian ahead of target, and Willian ends up sliding the ball out to Azpilicueta. When Azpilicueta receives the ball, you end up seeing Mount darting in between Mings and target, Giroud between the center backs, Barkley breaking into the box between Kante and Hause, and then you have Pulisic peeling off Kante's shoulder. So when Azpilicueta delivers the ball around target and Mings, Giroud does try to get towards it, but it falls into the path of the Villa goalkeeper. The build-up to Chelsea's equalizer followed an identical pattern. The only difference here was that Christensen this time wrapped the ball around Grealish into Azpilicueta, and rather than having Mount dart in between Mings and target, you ended up seeing Willian ahead of that gap, and it was Pulisic getting onto Azpilicueta's cross at that back post. Azpilicueta was involved in the second goal minutes later, but as you could see, both managers were reluctant to shift their intended tactics in this game. Lampard found a gap out in those wider areas by pushing the fullbacks forward, and as they continuously looked to play through Azpilicueta, Mount, and Willian, Chelsea were able to get 2 goals created through Azpilicueta, which justifies Lampard's tactics. However, when you look to Aston Villa, that 4-1-4-1 possibly should have been shifted to a 5-4-1. You drop Douglas Luiz into that center back role, and now you have Target and Konsa being able to occupy those wider areas so that Alonso and Azpilicueta can't consistently break forward freely. That would have possibly been a better route for Aston Villa, because now you still have those midfielders very narrow, and even if the ball is shifted out into those zones, you can have Grealish and El Ghazi eventually come across to provide protection if Chelsea look to overload those zones. However, they didn't do that, and Chelsea consistently bombarded those wider areas, eventually scored 2 goals, and that was the key tactical pattern throughout this game. Hi everybody, thanks for watching, and subscribe here for your latest tactical analysis and daily commentary on the InnerViews show. And if that wasn't enough, don't forget you could find more organic, unfiltered soccer/football analysis on the InnerViews podcast, the best soccer/football podcast in the world, available on iTunes, Spotify, iHeartRadio, Spreaker, and any Android apps on your Android devices.